Well, hello everyone. We want to welcome you to our workshop today. This workshop is co-sponsored by the Military Law Task Force and the International Committee. And in just a moment, we'll be handing it off to Suzanne, who will be our moderator for today. I do want to mention, though, about our sponsoring, the organizations behind this. For the NLG's Cuba Committee, our website is nlgcuba.org, and encourage you to check it out. Our committee is kind of in a rebuilding stage right now, so this is a really good time to get involved. And so afterwards, also, if you want to give me your contact info, I'd be glad to get you on our mailing list for the International Committee. For the Cuba Subcommittee. And then for the Military Law Task Force, our website is nlgmltf.org. And finally mentioned the NLG International Committee is nlginternational.org. So I'm going to hand it off to Suzanne to get us started. Okay. Very good. And we do have one of our speakers who will be presenting remotely, which is what the screen is for. We'll try to have the sound as much as we can, but feel free to come closer if you need to. Apologize for the technological issues. This has been a challenging convention. We've made it work. And also, while we're waiting, I mentioned for our online folks watching, thank you so much for tuning in. And we will also have this recorded later. We'll have this up on online after this presentation as well, and probably next day or two. I can give it to you when we get to me. So I just do a bio speaker.
Okay. All right, that's easier. Let's do a bio before each speaker. Okay. I think everyone can hear me okay. Hi everyone, my name is Suzanne Adeley, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the International Committee. I have been for a very long time. This is a very common sight, like at our conventions. Like at every convention, we have to have, honestly, like multiple workshops about the status of the U.S. empire, about the reality of imperialism and neocolonialism throughout the world, and the kind of violence that it is perpetrating on communities around the world and reverberating back to our communities back here. And we're at a moment in which imperialist violence is at one of its highest, and it is very much at the root of the fascism that the fascist violence that we're also facing every single day. And I'm proud to be a member of the National Lawyers Guild that has always historically had a very strong analysis, although not necessarily always a homogeneous analysis, right? But a strong analysis about the existence of an empire, of U.S. empire, perpetrated also by the U.S. and its allies and corporations, and the duty of the legal community, including organizers, lawyers, and students, to use our platforms and use our expertise to expose the many levels of U.S. imperialism, and to use our resources and our skills and our platforms also to challenge it. Not just legally, like not just in the context of filing international criminal law complaints, but also defending those who are on the front lines of challenging imperialism, and whether that be here or there, and also that it also includes like many years of very strong relationships that we have with other lawyers throughout the world, whether it be Cuba or Venezuela or Palestine or the Philippines or Turkey, and learning what it means to be in collective struggle with them, as opposed to any kind of like Western paternalistic idea of solidarity. And so I want to thank the Military Law Task Force and the members of the International Committee, and particularly the members of the Task Force on the Americas, which is one of the subcommittees of the International Committee. Please come up to any of us to learn more about the International Committee if you'd like. Task Force on the Americas and the Military Law Task Force is doing outstanding work for the movement. It's not always acknowledged. And so I believe I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Marjorie Cohn. And somebody who I respect dearly, who I've worked with for a very long time in the International Committee and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Marjorie is professor emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego, dean of the People's Academy of International Law, ask us about that, and past president of the National Lawyers Guild. She is a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers and is the U.S. representative to the Advisory Council of the American Association of Jurists. Marjorie is a legal scholar and political analyst who writes books and articles and lectures throughout the world about international human rights law, U.S. foreign policy, and the contradiction between the two. She has testified before Congress and debated the legality of the war in Afghanistan at the Oxford Union. Her books include The United States in Torture, Interrogation, Incarceration, and Abuse, Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues, and Rules of Disengagement, The Politics and Honor of Military of Dissent, with Kathy Gilbert, who's a member of the Military Law Task Force, and Cowboy Republic, 6 Ways the Bush Gang Has Defied the Law. She is a regular columnist for Truth Out. Marjorie?
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm delighted to be with you, even though remotely. I wish I could be there in person.
Marjorie, let me try a few things on the sound. We're having some sound issues. Let's try that. Marjorie, could you say something real quick?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Is that picking up at all?
Hello?
That's a great question. Oh, it's actually that's the mic. Let's try it. Marjorie, can you say something again?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Donald Trump's regime has taken U.S. imperialism into a new, more dangerous, more transparent phase. Whereas prior administrations were more subtle about their violations of international law, Trump has declared that there is no international law, that we are now governed by his own morality. An oxymoron by the moron in chief. A whole civilization will die tonight, Trump threatened on Tuesday. That was the intent, to commit genocide. The U.S. and Israel have killed more than 5,000 people in Iran, displaced more than 1 million civilians, assassinated Iran's spiritual and intellectual leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, and murdered 39 Iranian statesmen, including the scientific genius Dr. Ali Larijani, Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. The U.S.-Israeli war of aggression against Iran violates the United Nations Charter, which requires that all states settle their disputes peacefully and refrain from the use of armed force except in self-defense after an armed attack against a UN state by another state or when the Security Council authorizes it. Before February 28th, Iran had not mounted an armed attack against any country, nor did it pose an imminent threat to the US, Israel, or any other UN member state. And the Security Council had not authorized the use of military force against Iran. It is Iran that has the right to self-defense. That includes targeting US military assets in the region and closing the Strait of Hormuz. States that allow attacks on Israel to be launched from their territory can be blocked, and Iran can prevent neutral ships from trading with states with which it is in conflict. Israel has killed more than 1,888 people in Lebanon. At least 303 have been killed and 1,150 wounded on Wednesday alone. Israel launched more than 100 airstrikes in just 10 minutes. The US and Israel are targeting civilians in Gaza, Iran, and Lebanon, a war crime under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Israel's current genocide is the first live-streamed genocide in history. Since October 7th, 2023, Israel has massacred well over 77,000 Palestinian civilians, displaced 2 million Palestinian people, and destroyed the infrastructure of Gaza while continuing to deny humanitarian aid to a whole population. All this with genocidal intent. That constitutes genocide under the Genocide Convention. The US government has long provided economic, military, diplomatic, and political assistance to the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. The Obama administration committed to $3.8 billion in annual military assistance to Israel through 2028. Joe Biden's administration aided and abetted Israel's genocide in Gaza, providing $17.9 billion in military aid to Israel since October 7th, 2023. And Trump continues to aid and abet Netanyahu's genocide in Gaza, Netanyahu's vendetta against Iran, and Netanyahu's longtime goal of ethnically cleansing southern Lebanon of the Palestinians who live there. Together, these two war criminals, Netanyahu indicted, Trump unindicted, are conducting a war of aggression on Iran. In January 2024, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, issued a near unanimous ruling that South Africa had presented a plausible case that Israel was violating the Genocide Convention. In July 2024, the ICJ ruled that Israel was illegally occupying the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. The court held that international law prohibits the acquisition of territory by threat or use of force and protects the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. In September 2024, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution to implement the ICJ's ruling on the illegality of the occupation. It called for an arms embargo and other sanctions on Israel until it stopped its international law violations. It acted under the Uniting for Peace resolution, which empowers the General Assembly to take action when the Security Council fails to maintain international peace and security due to a lack of unanimity of its permanent members. The U.S. has vetoed 6 Security Council resolutions aimed at stopping Israel's carnage in Gaza. In November 2024, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts. The 124 states parties to the Rome Statute have a legal obligation to arrest Netanyahu and Gallant and send them to the ICC if they are caught in the state's territory. The Rome Statute also punishes the crime of genocide, but in spite of the ICJ's finding that Israel was plausibly engaging in genocide, the ICC prosecutor did not seek arrest warrants for genocide for Netanyahu and Gallant. In 1947, the General Assembly committed the United Nations' original sin when it partitioned Palestine to create Israel. This launched the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people, and the establishment of a settler colonial state. 78 years later, in November 2025, the UN Security Council committed the UN's second cardinal sin. It enshrined Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian lands, put its imprimatur on Israel's genocide, and granted colonial control over the lives of the Palestinians to the United States, which has aided and abetted the genocide. The Council adopted a resolution that granted control over Gaza to the US-led Board of Peace, and it ordered the deployment of a US-led occupation force called International Stabilization Force. Donald Trump will oversee both colonial bodies in collaboration with Israel. Palestinians will not be allowed to participate in their own governance. The resolution violates the ICJ's holding that self-determination is an inalienable right of the Palestinian people. Meanwhile, Trump is implementing his 2025 national security strategy to control the Western Hemisphere. It includes the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, signaling a return to U.S. military interventions in Latin America. As part of its offensive against Venezuela, the Trump administration has illegally attacked civilian and commercial vessels with weapons and drones, boarded vessels, destroyed boats, kidnapped crew members of ships, and carried out extrajudicial executions of crew members of smaller boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. It has imposed illegal unilateral coercive measures and an unlawful oil blockade against Venezuela and stolen Venezuela's oil. And it illegally attacked Venezuela, killing 100 people, and kidnapped President Nicolás Maduro and National Assembly Deputy Celia Flores. Maduro has head of state immunity from foreign enforcement jurisdiction. The U.S. withdrawal of recognition of him as head of the Venezuelan government does not negate his personal immunity under customary international law. The U.S. government has imposed unilateral coercive measures on Venezuela without UN Security Council approval in violation of the UN Charter, which empowers only the Security Council to impose and enforce sanctions. This constitutes collective punishment, which is outlawed by the Fourth Geneva Convention. The Trump administration has given indications that Cuba could be next on its hit list, although Trump is preoccupied with Iran and Lebanon at the moment. Forcible regime change is illegal, whether in Cuba, Venezuela, or Iran. The UN Charter prohibits the use or threat of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. Both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights guarantee the right to self-determination. In accordance with Marco Rubio's long-standing vendetta against Cuba, Trump issued an executive order on January 29th aimed at tightening the U.S. noose around Cuba's neck. Trump preposterously declared Cuba an unusual and extraordinary threat without providing a shred of evidence, and warned that he would impose punitive tariffs on states that deliver fuel to Cuba. His intention is to suffocate the Cuban people who rely on oil for 80% of their electricity. Several UN human rights experts called Trump's executive order a serious violation of international law and an extreme form of unilateral economic coercion with extraterritorial effects, through which the United States seeks to exert coercion on the sovereign state of Cuba and compel other sovereign third states to alter their lawful commercial relations under the threat of punitive trade measures. The U.S. maintains a 67-year embargo blockade of Cuba, unilateral coercive measures, and now an unlawful naval blockade, which is considered an act of war, denying it access to oil. The Cuban people have suffered blackouts, hospitals are denied power, and cars don't run. Trump's administration is trying to strangle the Cuban people so they will overthrow their government. After the 1959 Cuban Revolution, the Eisenhower administration declared a partial embargo on trade with Cuba to pressure the people to overthrow their new communist government. The embargo was based on a secret State Department memo that proposed a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. 2 years later, John F. Kennedy expanded the embargo, and it persists to this day, having been enshrined in a blockade with Helms-Burton during the Clinton administration. Obama tried to loosen some of the worst features of the blockade, but they were quickly reimposed by Trump during his first administration, and they continue through the Biden administration, and they continue today. On October 29th, 2025, for the 33rd consecutive year, the General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted a resolution calling for an end to the U.S. economic, commercial, and financial embargo of Cuba. So what can we do? Urge the enforcement of the General Assembly Uniting for Peace resolution calling for an arms embargo on Israel. That would halt its killing in Gaza, Iran, and Lebanon. Participate in the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, or BDS movement, which is achieving increasing success. Lobby Congress to pass a War Powers resolution calling a halt to U.S. aggression in Iran and lift the vicious blockade against Cuba. Write op-eds and letters to the editor, and support mass mobilizations to stop the slaughter and demand accountability for the perpetrators. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marjorie. Okay, next speaker is Leonardo Flores, who is an organizer with Cohn. He's a Venezuelan political analyst, and he's a founding member of the Venezuela Solidarity Network and the Alliance for Cuba Engagement in Response. We were actually recently in Cuba together, where he helped lead a very large convoy, actually. And he's also been a frequent speaker in many of the webinars that both NLG and I as well have put on. So thank you for joining us, Leonardo.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Suzanne and James and Susan, for organizing this. And also the NLG for the many years of solidarity and work that you all have done on Venezuela. It's been incredibly important, not just for the solidarity efforts that we're undertaking, but for advocacy in Congress as well. So I hope you keep that up, not just for Venezuela, but also for Palestine and Cuba and all the other international places that you're expressing solidarity against U.S. empire. So before kind of jumping into, the attack on January 3rd and what happened afterwards, I think it's kind of important to talk a little bit about everything that's been happening beforehand. And just very briefly, I'm going to give a timeline because it gives kind of insight into the breadth and the depth of the U.S. Aggression against Venezuela over the past 27 years. But I'm going to start in 2013, which is when President Chavez passes away. 2 months after that, President Maduro wins the first election. It's an election that's much closer than expected. He won by about 1.5 percentage points. He was expected to win by like 5 or 6 points. Immediately, the United States refused to recognize these elections, refused to recognize President Maduro. And that set off a wave of post-electoral violence in Venezuela, where about 13 people died in this opposition violence, I should say. 2014, there was an attempted color revolution in Venezuela, again led by right-wing violence. They were responsible, so about 47 people died over about a period of 3 months. The right wing the protesters themselves were responsible for more than half of those deaths. This led the U.S. Congress to pass a law called the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act, which ordered President Obama to impose quote-unquote sanctions. And sanctions isn't the correct term here because the only power, as Marjorie mentioned, the only body that can actually impose sanctions is the United Nations. When the United States or Europe or Canada, which have been the three countries to impose the most measures against Venezuela, when they do it, it's not actually a sanction. It's a unilateral coercive measure under international law. 2015, Obama declares Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. Again, absurd. Venezuela's very clearly never been a threat to the United States. He then applies the first unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela, mostly against Venezuelan leaders, including the president of the central bank. 2017, another failed color revolution, and this time I think it was roughly 125 people died over a period of about 5 months. Again, led by the right-wing thugs on the street. This time they were very more heavily armed. They were responsible for a plurality of the deaths on that occasion. Late 2017, the Trump administration imposes the first sectoral unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela, targeting Venezuela's central bank and its oil industry, its state-owned oil company called PDVSA. 2018, Maduro survives an attempted assassination by drone. 2019, Juan Guaido, a guy who nobody in Venezuela had ever heard of prior to then, he declares himself the president of the country, and he's backed by not only Trump, but about 50 plus other countries. Later that year, the United States imposes what the Wall Street Journal characterized as a total economic blockade on Venezuela. 2020, there was an attempted mercenary invasion where a group of mercenaries allegedly contracted by Juan Guaido attempted to enter Venezuela with the intention of not only kidnapping Maduro, and at that point there was U.S. Navy ships off the coast of Venezuela, so this was a feasible plan from their part, but also they had this really, I don't even have the right adjectives to describe this contract that they had signed with Juan Guaido, because it basically gave them a carte blanche to kill in Venezuela anyone that they suspected would be of being Chavista, which is a supporter of the Bolivarian government, the Bolivarian Revolution. It was really kind of something like out of the dirty wars in Central America, with the U.S. basically killing anyone that they suspected to be an ally of revolutionary forces. 2021, COVID hit, and the United States blocked Venezuela from receiving COVID vaccines. They also blocked Venezuela from receiving their special drawing rights, which was this program by the IMF where every country in the world had access to these funds that would allow them to kind of restart their economies after COVID. Venezuela was one of the very few countries, along with, I believe, with Iran and maybe one other country, that was prevented from accessing these funds due to the United States. 2022, the Venezuelan government and moderate opposition, because in Venezuela there's a wide spectrum of opposition, and the U.S. basically favors the extreme right, the fascists, but there's a more moderate group that isn't necessarily moderate in its politics. Many are neoliberal or even neocons, but they're moderate in the sense that they haven't expressed a desire to invade Venezuela from another country or to impose more unilateral coercive measures. Anyway, they came to an agreement whereby $3 billion in Venezuelan funds would be released to the United Nations, and the UN would administer this money for healthcare, education, and electricity. It was all contingent on the President Biden at the time, giving it the okay. Biden never released that money. Trump has never released that money. That money's still there, still frozen. And then, so this is really kind of just a broad overview of the hybrid war against Venezuela. And if you don't know what hybrid war means, it's this idea that of a war that encompasses areas beyond the military. So it's a diplomatic war in the sense that, they try to impose a president and isolate Venezuela. And obviously the biggest component is the economic war in Venezuela, the so-called sanctions. The economic war in Venezuela led to a 99% drop in government revenue. It caused $630 billion in economic damages. And we know from scholarly articles that sanctions or unilateral coercive measures have impacts on healthcare, education, inflation, migration, and mortality. All of that happened in Venezuela. According to CEPR, which is a progressive think tank based in DC, in just their first year alone, the Trump sanctions on Venezuela killed 40,000 people. There were 40,000 excess deaths because of those sanctions. And in late 2024, there was a study in The Lancet, which is a prestigious medical journal, and this study found that globally, sanctions kill more than 560,000 people every year, and more than half of those victims are children. But something curious started happening in Venezuela beginning in 2021, which is that the economy hit rock bottom and the country started to grow. So there are 5 straight years of economic growth, including the last 4 is, I think, the leader of Latin America in terms of economic growth. But despite this growth, today, GDP is 36% of what it was in 2012. So 5 years of economic growth has only managed to get to about a third of where we were in the past. So this is an economic recovery in Venezuela is going to take a decade plus. It's been a lost decade and a half thanks to U.S. hybrid warfare. And that's actually one of the reasons that the Trump administration decided to tighten its measures against Venezuela and attack Venezuela, because Venezuela was finding a way out from underneath the economic warfare caused by the United States. So in 2025, in August, Trump deploys the Navy to the Caribbean. It's the largest military deployment in the region ever from the United States. And then in September, as Marjorie mentioned, they begin striking boats. Nobody knows who's on these boats. There's never been any sort of confirmation that there were ever any drugs on these boats or that the people on it were drug traffickers, but that's kind of the narrative that the U.S. government used and that the media followed with. There were 47 boats struck, and it's interesting because they're all kind of mentioned in the context of Venezuela, but 32 of these boats were hit in the Pacific, and Venezuela doesn't have a Pacific coastline. In fact, of the 47, I think maybe the first and one other certainly came from Venezuela. The others came from other countries in the region, and it really shows how the Monroe Doctrine, and I'll talk about this a bit more, is in full effect, and how they're really internationalizing this war in Venezuela to be a kind of a war on the left at large against the left in Latin America, on Cuba as well, of course. In November, the USS Gerald Ford was deployed to the coast of Venezuela. Throughout this whole time, between August and December, Puerto Rico became even more heavily militarized. In late November as well, the U.S. declared a no-fly zone in Venezuela without any attacks at the time, but it still caused a massive impact in terms of airlines. Then in December, there was the blockade of oil, of Venezuelan oil, where Venezuela was prevented from selling any of its oil, including sending oil to Cuba that it had agreed to in terms of not exactly selling, but a trade between medical expertise and help and doctors for oil, a program that had been in place for over 20 years. And they also started seizing tankers called Venezuelan oil all over the world. I think the last one was seized a little less than a month ago in the Indian Ocean. So this is an ongoing thing. And the narrative around all of this military buildup was that it was an anti-drug operation, that Maduro was the so-called head of a cartel de los soles, and that he had unleashed a different criminal organization called the Tren de Aragua on the United States. All of this is completely false. I can go into it a little bit more on the Q&A, but I don't want to focus on that too much because there was something curious that really happened in late December. And that's that the narrative changed from being about anti-drugs, anti-narcotics, or narco-terrorism, to a narrative about Venezuela's ties to Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And this coincides with a visit by Netanyahu to the United States. He was here in the United States New Year's Eve. And then 3 days later, January 3rd, you have the bombing of Venezuela and the kidnapping of President Maduro and the first combatant, Flores. You know, more than 100 people died in this attack, including civilians, including Venezuelan soldiers, and including 32 Cubans who were part of President Maduro's security team. And in one of the only statements, the public statements made by the defense minister at the time, he said that they were killed in cold blood, the Cubans specifically, meaning that they were likely executed by the U.S. Delta forces that invaded and attacked Venezuela. This was a massive attack on a country that has, historically pushed for peace, not just regionally, but globally. There were 150 planes. It was this mass cyber attack going after Venezuela's air defenses. There was a nationwide blackout. And it was also the first confirmed use of AI in a U.S. military strike. They used, I think it was a variant of Claude by Anthropic in planning out this attack against Venezuela. And yet, while this attack was very clearly a military victory for the Trump administration, it wasn't a political victory because it didn't lead to what they had wanted, which was either a coup, some sort of uprising or rebellion. And that's what the U.S. has been after in Venezuela for decades, is regime change. And there's absolutely been no regime change in Venezuela. And right now there's a lot of talk about whether the revolution in Venezuela has been defeated because, right now, currently the U.S. controls Venezuela's oil commerce, meaning that there's only 2 traders authorized to trade in Venezuelan oil. One is a company called Trafigura, which is heavily, marked by corruption investigations in the past, and the other one is a company called Int'l, which is one of the major funders of one of Trump's PACs. The U.S. is basically also controlling Venezuela's oil income. All the money from Venezuela's oil gets sent to an account. First it was in the UAE, now I'm not even sure where it is. And then that money gets filtered to Venezuela, where they can only spend it with so-called authorization from the State Department. On top of that, there's been changes to important laws in Venezuela, the oil law, the hydrocarbon law, the mining laws, to allow for greater participation from U.S. companies. And again, that was never, Venezuela's always been after better participation or more investment from U.S. companies. It was the United States that was preventing that. And there's also an amnesty law that happened, allowing people who had been taking part in anti-government actions over the years to receive amnesty. Though of course there were exceptions for people who were calling for an invasion or sanctions, or people who were involved in murder. And yet, despite this, we can't say that there's been any sort of regime change in Venezuela. There's been no transition. There's been no changes in social policy. There's still a huge emphasis on people's power. The communes are still intact. Communal councils are intact. There's still a civil military police unity. There's 8 million people in Venezuela's militias, so that kind of explains why the United States hasn't attempted to invade or occupy the country, because they know that at that point Venezuela would be able to fight back, whereas it wasn't able to fight back against the bombing and the invasion. Oil in Venezuela hasn't been privatized. New elections haven't been called. And what's really most telling about this entire thing is that Venezuela's fascists are incredibly upset with the Trump administration, not only because there hasn't been any sort of transition or regime change, but also because he threw their leader, Maria Corina Machado, the winner of the Nobel Prize, who then gave the Nobel Prize to Trump, he threw her under the bus in one of the few acts of him telling the truth, which is that she has no support in Venezuela. And right now, it's, a lot of the criticism on the Trump administration about Venezuela is coming from the right in terms of this regime. The regime is still intact. And when I say the right, I don't mean other Republicans. I'm talking about Democrats. The Democrats are hitting Trump on the right on Venezuela because Maria Corina Machado has been making the rounds to Democratic leaders and telling them that she needs to be the one in charge. So it's very clearly a bipartisan effort to topple the Venezuelan government. The people in Venezuela right now, the social movements, the revolutionaries, they're calm but also very wary, and they're really eager to take action, but there's no one really to take action against right now. They still support the government, and they may be concerned about some of the things that are going on, but they're also very ready to take action should something greater go on. And they're on the streets calling for the liberation of President Maduro and First Combatant Flores. And then now I do want to focus in a little bit on the Monroe Doctrine, because so why is Venezuela being targeted, right? It's being targeted for resources, greatest oil reserves in the world, huge natural gas reserves, gold, rare earth minerals, you name it. It's also being targeted for geopolitics, because over the past 27 years, Venezuela has been one of the leaders in the world, I would say, in denouncing U.S. imperialism. And not just that, not just denouncing imperialism, but building a regional network of integration with Cuba through the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas, through the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, with SALAC, the Community of Latin American Countries and Latin American and Caribbean Countries, UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. So these are all multilateral organizations designed to strengthen regional integration in the face of possible U.S. aggression. But since the Obama administration, the U.S. has been steadily undermining all of these multilateral venues, right? And right now, the most pressing concern is the so-called Shield of the Americas. This was launched about a month ago, and it's basically a military coordination effort between the United States and 13 countries in the region, where they're going to, quote, stop foreign interference, narco-terrorism, and illegal immigration. And we've already seen the first results of this Shield of the Americas with a bombing in Ecuador carried out by the Ecuadorian armed forces in conjunction with the U.S. military. And what they bombed turned out to be a dairy farm. And one of the bombs fell into Colombia. So the United States right now is doing really awful things aimed at splitting up Latin American Union to the extent that it still exists, and pitting different countries against each other. So not only has there been this attack on Ecuador, but there's also been electoral interference in Honduras in November, including the freeing of Juan Orlando Hernandez, the known drug trafficker, convicted drug trafficker, which undercuts all of the accusations against President Maduro, by the way. There have been military and economic threats against Colombia, against Mexico, the threat of lawfare against President Petro in Colombia, who just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. said that they were investigating him for narco-terrorism, I believe it was. Threats of tariffs against Brazil. We have foreign troops right now in Haiti. And so what we're seeing is basically the Monroe Doctrine being not just revived, because it never really died. You know, the Obama administration under Secretary Kerry claimed that it wanted to move on from that, but their actions really did not reflect that at all. They were actually strengthening the Monroe Doctrine. But now with Trump, it's taken on a different dimension because they're being very open about what they want. And what they want is Latin American and the Caribbean resources, and to kick out the so-called foreign actors, meaning China and Russia and to a lesser extent, Iran. And so right now what this calls for is a really increased solidarity from us here in the United States. And we have to understand that what's coming is going to be much worse than what's been happening over the past 5 or 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo. That was very, comprehensive, heavy, but inspiring also at the same time. So thank you very much. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce the Deputy Chief Mission of the Embassy, the Deputy Chief of the Embassy of Cuba in the United States, Dr. Tanieres Diegeuz, did I say that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Who is a Cuban diplomat and lawyer specializing in public international law and constitutional law. She was born on August 15th in Matanzas, Cuba, and she earned her Bachelor of Laws from the University of Havana in 2006, and her PhD in Legal Sciences from the same institution in 2023. She holds advanced training from prestigious international programs, including the Hague Academy of International Law, the International Law Commission Seminar, and specialized courses at the UN in both general international law and law of the sea. Since 2009, she has served as assistant professor of international law, constitutional law, and theory of state and law at the University of Havana Law School and the Raul Roa Garcia Higher Institute of International Relations. She is the author and co-author of books and specialized academic articles. Her diplomatic career includes key positions at the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Affairs, notably as legal advisor and Cuba's representative to the 6th Committee of the UN General Assembly between 2012 and 2017, first secretary and counselor in the Directorate General for Multilateral Affairs and International Law from 2017 to 22. From 2023 to 2025, she served as ambassador of Cuba to the Commonwealth of Australia. And since December 2025, she has been deputy chief of the mission of the Embassy of Cuba in the U.S. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for these very warm words of welcome. I would like to remark that the professor who speaks at the first level of this panel explained very good about the Cuban situation, the history of the blockade in general. I would like only to take this opportunity to remark a few things, how we see legally speaking, the issue of the unilateral coercive measure taken by the United States government against Cuba. In particular, why we consider that are not legal under international law, first of all, and second one, how we see that this coercive measure has been taken during many years and has been adopted the characteristic of genocide against the Cuban people. First of all, as everybody knows, the unilateral coercive measure United States has trying to give to the issue of bilateral relations with Cuba, that has been taken as bilateral situation between both countries are is not, because this unilateral coercive measure has not only impact in the third country and citizens of the third country, if not, that is a concrete violation of the rights of the citizens of these countries and the sovereignty of the third countries. This has been shown with a lot of measures and a lot of acts, in particular facts that has been taking place during many years, during more than 60 years of blockade, and this is one first point that we are want to remark. Of course, that the blockade is not only one rule; it's a big conglomerate of rules, internal rule of the United States that have extraterritorial effect, as our previous speaker explained, and these extraterritorial effects has damaged not only the United States citizen or Cuban citizen, if not as well, that has damage, concrete damage to the different third states. And this has been demonstrated in the Secretary General report that every year the Secretary General of the United Nations requests to the different countries to submit the impact that they have received during 1 year of the blockade of Cuba, taking into consideration that every year the General Assembly of the United Nations adopts the resolution necessity to put end to the blockade the United States to Cuba. And under this resolution, the Secretary General requests to the different state members this information. And every year we have, internationally speaking, in United Nations, a big report in which you can see what is the complete damage around the world of the blockade and the extraterritorial effect of the blockade. Having said that, of course, Cuba as country as well present the impact of the blockade during the year, every year on this report, and there is a lot of information under this report about what is the impact of the blockade each year. This is one thing that I would like to address and to ratify, even that our previous speaker speak about that. But in the other hand, we have the issue of the Convention of Genocide. And the Convention of Genocide in the Article 2.6 is very clear, what the Convention considers that is a genocide. And it's very clear that any acts against groups or nationals or any ethnics, it's very clear the concept. If we take into consideration the text of the Convention of Genocide and direct text that our previous colleague expressed on the Lester-Mallory Memorandum, since the blockade was imposed in the decade of 60, that said directly the only way to, change the regime in Cuba and to finish with the Cuban population is to kill the Cuban population by hunger, creating desperation. It's textual what the Lester-Mallory Memorandum says. He qualified as genocide directly. I don't need other proof because this is a complete document. It's a formal document. It's a memorandum from one embassy from the United States to the authorities, the administration of the United States, and said exactly what the Convention of Genocide said that is genocide. And it's like a declaration of genocide. And this is why we consider that this kind of event in which we can explain and we can have a dialogue about what happened in different countries, this different kind of situation that we have been facing during many years is very important. When I explain to my students, different issues on international law, but in particular the relation between Cuba and the United States that has been marked, of course, for history as well, I explained, yes, of course, the United States have a history with Latin American. in particular with Cuba. But we have a particularity because in our history, there is no country in Latin America that was born a republic with one amendment in their constitution made by U.S. senators. The only country that grew up and became a nation with an amendment made by U.S. senators in their constitution was Cuba. The amendment Platt that was imposed to the Cuban constitution in 1901, amendment Platt because it was made by the Senator Platt at that moment, was made by the Senator Platt and was imposed to the Cuban constitution at that time, saying that the Guantanamo base is on the United States, saying that many things, 7 articles that create like a colony for United States. This is a reality. After that, Cuban people fight for delete, for get out this amendment from the Constitution. And we did it, but United States and in that time, the government of Cuba signed the permanent treaty, taking the text of the amendment to the permanent treaty. Because it's necessary to explain that. Why? Because it's important that the people know the history. We need to learn from the history. And this is why today the Cuban Constitution said that no treaty could be signed under threat, and we are not going to accept, and we are going to declare null any treaty that would be signed under threat and that would be include something regarding our sovereignty. Article 11 and 12 of the Cuban Constitution. You know, this is coming from the history, and we need to know why the Cuban relation with the United States is like that today. Because we came from that. We came from different aggression, we came from different threats, we came from the wish of the United States to take Cuba every time. And we came from fight a lot for our independence. And this is why we will continue to do that, because our independence is a sacred thing for Cuba. It's part of our history, it's part of our, of our main values, and this is not under negotiation in any case. And why I give a lot of importance to explain that, because there is a lot of misinformation about what happened in Cuba, why the Cubans are like that, why the Cubans are very, we are like that because we came from that. We have behind all of this history, And having said that, we always have, after the revolution came to power in 1959, we made a lot of things, we made a lot of progress, social progress. We participate more on international arena, help others, extend the solidarity, etc. But we will continue trying to have a good relation with the American people as well. We always have conveyed, it's not new, it's a lie that Cuba don't want to have good relations with the American people, No, we want to have good relations with the American people, and this message has been conveyed to the different administrations of the United States. We want to sit and talk. Obama period showed that we are able to do that. And we can have good relations, we can have progress on the relation, and we can sit and talk about any issue. It's not issue forbidden on the table, but only with one request: respect of our sovereignty. We are not going to negotiate our sovereignty. This is the normal rule on international law to speak each other, to speak with other countries. And this is that us keep the peace around the world. Why we keep the peace? Because at the final, the states keep the respect each other, sit and talk, and this is why we are keep the peace after the Second World War. Otherwise, we are not going to keep the peace in the world. And this is what we are request. It's not something very difficult to do. Anyway, having said that, it's not the blockade, or as part of the blockade and the Helms-Burton Act, that is other unilateral coercive measure, etc. The big conglomerate of rule of the blockade. In January 29, as the professor explained very good, the current administration take other unilateral coercive measures, escalating the pressure that we already have under the rules of the blockade. I mean, it's a maximum pressure measure, prohibiting all shipment of oil to Cuba, and this is creating humanitarian impact, humanitarian damage to the Cuban population, under the argument that this is not against the Cuban people, but the reality is that all of this is exactly against to the Cuban people, because the Cuban people is who's suffering the blackout and the blackout of energy in the hospitals. The Cuban people is suffering. I mean, we don't have transportation. We have more than 96,000 people waiting for surgery, including 11,000 children, and there is no explanation to a mother for that, for say that the children don't have a surgery for cancer because we don't have oil. We don't have other word to characterize this kind of conduct under international law, under domestic law, that is cruelty. It's like simple like that. When you create constant damage to the Cuban, to a people, any people around the world, in this case it's our people, but any people around the world, constantly, and you know that life that there is life that will be in danger, in particular life of children, life of pregnancy people, life of elderly, you have been a cruel act. You have been criminal. It's a collective punishment to a people. How can I call that genocide? It's not other word to characterize this. You want to kill massive and collective way a people of Cuba. But we are going to resist, we are going to be creative under these circumstances, and we are going to overcome the situation and never will surrender, because this is our main value. And this is the legacy that the Cuban people can give to other people, and the legacy that we are lived. I mean, we prefer as you know, burn the country before to give the country to other imperialist nation. I mean, I am very open to question. I don't want to take more time than I permitted. And well, thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here.
Welcome.
And I think we will have time for some questions at the very end.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And let me again express my appreciation to Cuba for the role that they've played in global solidarity, historically and currently, and also, you know, teaching us that another world is possible. Thank you. So now I'm going to introduce James. James M. Branum is an Oklahoma City attorney who has practiced military defense law since 2006, including representing many resistors of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thank you, James, for doing that. He regularly teaches CLEs and other workshops on military and civil rights issues, and is also deeply involved in interfaith advocacy and activism.
Well, first of all, just an honor to get to participate in this panel, and particularly to be here with our Cuban colleague, and just hearing from her firsthand is just a great honor to be here. As we heard from Marjorie a few minutes ago, International law is 100% very clear that Trump's imperial aggressions against the peoples of the world are absolutely illegal. There is no legal justification for the U.S. invasion of Venezuela, to say nothing of the kidnapping of the head of state and his wife. There is no legal justification, legitimate legal justification, for the U.S. attacks on vessels on the high seas. There is no legal justification, from an international law perspective at least, for the ongoing U.S. blockade against Cuba. And of course, there is no legal justification for U.S. cooperation with Israeli war crimes in Gaza, Lebanon, and now Iran. International law, most notably the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, makes it clear that simply saying, "I'm just following orders," doesn't work if the illegal orders are to commit genocide or crimes against humanity. Those are two categories that there's never, ever, under any circumstances, a justification for. It doesn't matter what the excuse is. If it's genocide, if it's crimes against humanity, it is always illegal. And it is always illegal to participate or to support genocide or crimes against humanity. Today, U.S. military service members are directly impacted by these potentially illegal orders, which is why I'm part of the panel today, as a defense attorney who represents service members who are struggling with what to do, not only legally, but also ethically and morally. And I'm going to pause here for a moment to say that one thing is very important for all of us, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a legal worker, to know that we have an obligation to not only talk about the law. I know it's easy to get tunnel vision to say, this is legal, this isn't. That's important. But we also have a duty, and if you look at the Bar Code of Ethics, it makes it clear we have an obligation to talk about the other things, the context, the moral, the ethical issues, the societal issues. That's all part of the conversation. And I want to encourage everyone, we need to bring all of that to the table. So in having these conversations today, one of the problems I have in talking to my clients is explaining what international law says and how that is not always reflected under U.S. law, or more likely, U.S. practice. Our Constitution makes it clear, by the way, this should not be an unsettled question. The Constitution's treaty clause says that treaties that have been properly enacted are the supreme law of the land. That would include the UN Charter and its prohibition of wars except in cases of immediate self-defense or when authorized by the UN Security Council. Unfortunately, that even though that's what our Constitution says, the problem is it's all in the details. It's all in how that constitutional provision is respected by the courts or not respected by the courts. And more importantly, how it functions in the military context. Because bear in mind, military courts-martial are not part of the judicial branch. They're part of the executive branch. It functions quite differently in some key ways. And so understanding that raises some really troubling challenges. Because under U.S. law, both military laws, federal statutes, military regulations, our government largely ignores its obligations under international law, at least in practice. Often there are things that would indicate something else. And that is the good news. The UCMJ and military regulations do say that that a service member cannot be punished for disobeying an illegal order. The problem is that the Uniform Code of Military Justice and all the regulations, one, do not define what an illegal order is, number one. Number two, they have created a situation where only one person can make a definitive ruling on whether an order is illegal or not. What would you guess that person might be? Well, actually, it's a military judge in a court-martial. Now, here's why that's a problem. Well, there's one of several problems. We'll begin with the most obvious one. Very often, when a service member faces problems in the military, they can be prosecuted in a court-martial. Often they will not be. They will instead be administratively separated, losing access to benefits that they have earned. If you raise the issue of illegal orders in an administrative separation context, they don't have to listen to you because, again, The rules say only the judge can make a ruling. And also, bear in mind, you can't just call up the judge, get an advisory opinion. The Administrative Separation Board can't do that. Why? In the military, judges are only in office when they've been convened into existence by the general or the admiral, someone at that convening authority level, which means there's not truly a sitting judge even to make rulings, which means military service members are faced with this terrible choice, which is that they can disobey an order they believe is unlawful, and then they have to hope for the best. If it goes to court, they get the chance to argue this to the judge. But again, under the rules, the military judge, they've defined the issue of legality of orders as being a question of law, not a fact, which means the jury, if you're having a court-martial panel adjudicating your hearing, they don't make the decision on this. It's only the judge. That's not a good situation. And so based upon this incongruence, we really are at a really terrible... Oh, also, one other thing I should mention that's really important. In this context, who has the burden of proof to show that an order is illegal? The defendant. So the government does not have to prove an order is legal. Now, you would think of it the other way around. If the government is ordering people to kill someone else, you would think you would have to justify that. To me, that's not how it works. Rather, how the system is set up is that there's a presumption that orders are legal. And hence, for a service member to be able to prevail, they have to prove, not to a commander, not to anyone else, just simply to a judge, to a military judge that only gets convened when a service member is being prosecuted. That's the only way this gets tested. That is not a good situation. So, in light of this reality, I'll share a few practical things we can do in response to this. And again, I welcome questions. We get to questions at the end as well. First of all, though, for the MLTF, we are seeking to provide legal support to empower individual service members to reclaim their lives and to have the information they need to make the best decisions possible. This includes supporting lawyers and legal workers to be ready to help them, but also is about outreach materials and self-help resources. One of the challenges we may be facing with this issue of illegal orders is service members maybe have a very short window of time before they're on a plane going overseas. And so that's why having self-help resources for them to at least make those initial decisions, even if they can't reach out to us, even if their cell phones get taken away, if they have access to those resources in advance, it can make a difference. Secondly, the broader peace and anti-imperialist activist communities need to be ready to provide legal, political, and practical support to U.S. service members when they act in obedience to their consciences and international law. We can expect there will be future showdowns, and we need to be ready. For the folks who are facing this, they're going to feel very isolated. They're going to be in a terrible position. We need to be ready to step up and help them. 3, we must deepen our work in educating the public, but especially rank-and-file military service members, about the long history of resistance to imperialism within the U.S. military and how that history changed history. The most notable example is the Vietnam War, where the collective work of course, the resistance in Vietnam, but also resistance by rank-and-file troops changed the outcome of the war. And that's an important thing to realize, that U.S. service members pushing back have changed the world before. They can change it again. Finally, we must deepen our commitment to an international law understanding and our commitment to solidarity with those nations and peoples under the gun of U.S. imperialism. We have to do that. It has to be a part of what we are, who we are, what we do as the Guild. Thank you.
They asked me to make some comments, but I'd rather just go to question and answer. Yes, Mark?
If a judge decides this is a crime and you can't refuse it, what position is the judge? Can the Secretary of Defense punish him? Can the higher-ups punish the judge?
In theory, no. In theory. You know how that goes. Yeah. But in theory, no, judges are insulated, that they could act independently, and at times in the past they have. Whether they would now or not, we don't know. I think some of the judges would, to be honest. There are some that I've encountered that I think would be fair. Some probably not, and some would be scared.
Barbara?
I actually have two things. One quick one. I hear that there's an increase in conscientious objector applications.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your experience?
Yes, I will say that especially the organization working on this especially is the Center on Conscience and War, and their numbers are through the roof in the number of calls they're getting. I will say conscientious objection is a challenging dynamic because for many service members, one of my clients years ago said, James, I don't want to fight for the U.S. I'll fight in a war of liberation. It's like, well, that's great, but you're not a CO then. You're something else. So conscientious objection is not going to be the end-all, be-all of it. But I do think, yes, and one of the things that's interesting is what has spurred the uptick in COs lately has largely been Gaza. Of my clients, that has been the number, which surprised me, honestly. And especially in the Air Force. That's where we're seeing it, because they're seeing that with the munitions we're loading on the planes are being sent over there. They're seeing that direct connection, and so that's one bit of hope that we are seeing.
So I'm remembering Aaron Bushnell.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, Aaron Bushnell was a member of the U.S. military who self-immolated himself in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. in protest of the genocide in Gaza. A beautiful soul. I see. Okay. I saw a hand back there. Yes. And then I'll come to the side. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'm gonna start back there.
Are we asking questions only to James first?
No,
No,
it's
for
the
anybody.
whole panel. Yeah.
There's two of us here.
I meant you because I saw you. Yeah.
For Leonardo specifically, we've seen like various reasons used in like many of these regime change operations, but you hinted at like one of the ones that seems to lack factual basis the most are these like apologies for like bullshit accusations of drug trafficking against Monroe. Can you get into more of why that accusation has come up and why they're using that specifically against them?
Well, I mean, the why is because they needed a pretext, right? I mean, the real reasons are obviously geopolitics and oil and anti-communism and white supremacy and all that. But the why is the pretext, and the pretext is a good one because when people, every average citizen in the U.S. thinks South America, they're obviously very likely might think cocaine. But Venezuela doesn't produce cocaine at all. It's zero. The UN has noted that. And in fact, back in the early 90s, which is when the so-called Cartel de los Soles first came into existence, it was actually a CIA operation. You can Google something called the CIA's Cocaine. It's a 60-minute segment. It's about 10 minutes long, and it talks about how the CIA tried to infiltrate the cartel of Pablo Escobar in Colombia using a general in Venezuela's National Guard. The Venezuelan National Guard at the time had a symbol of the sun on their arm, like a patch, and so it became the cartel of the sun, and they imported, I don't even know how many tons of cocaine it was, from Colombia through Venezuela into the U.S. And in that segment of 60 minutes, they say that more than 50% of the world's cocaine trafficked through Venezuela. And today's found the fastest, right? And that's the UN figures, the DEA figures as well, the coincide. The DEA itself, I read through 20 years of national drug threat assessments, which is the yearly report put out by the DEA. Not once did they ever mention the Cartel de los Soles. When they do mention the so-called Tren de Aragua, they say that they're small-scale drug traffickers. And on top of that, there was a National Intelligence Council memo that was leaked in early 2025, which said that there was no evidence of cooperation between the Tren de Aragua and the Venezuelan government, and in fact that the Venezuelan government had gone after the Tren de Aragua in terms of police and military relations. So yeah, I mean, it's just a pretext, and if it hadn't been cocaine, it would have been a different pretext like it became with Iran and Hezbollah last December.
All right, so I'm gonna jump around the room a little bit. Okay, so but like, I will see your hands. I'm gonna, Lena? Yeah.
This is Leonardo. Nice to see you again. We were in Venezuela together. Venezuela and Cuba obviously are such a source of inspiration for people in the global south and people resisting U.S. imperialism everywhere. I know I'm probably one of many people who have been a bit confused by the news coming out of Venezuela with regards to Delcy Rodriguez So I would be curious to hear your thoughts more on that. Like, she has, for the first time since Chavez nationalized the oil industry, opened it up to private investment, is my understanding, and now they're considering a similar law with regards to mining. And it seems like she's walking a tightrope. And so I'd just be interested in hearing more about.
Yeah, so she's certainly walking a tightrope because she has to take actions that not only satisfy the United States to a certain extent, but also don't isolate her base, or isolate her from her base. So in terms of the oil and the mining laws, so private investment has always been a part of it. It's been that Venezuela has a majority stake in all of these private ventures. But that began changing, and it wasn't with Betsy. It was something called the anti-blockade law that was approved in 2021, which was a way to overcome U.S. economic warfare, and that called for greater private investment as well. And so all of these things in terms of the internal laws that we're seeing change in Venezuela were actually begun by Maduro. And this was part of a plan that was put in place by Maduro. And the one stumbling block was, of course, U.S. policy towards Venezuela, which was the one preventing Venezuela from accessing not just foreign credit, but foreign investment as well. I would say that, I think that's like the most emblematic thing, the oil law and the mining law. But there's been massive underinvestment in these two fields because of the U.S. blockade. And so that necessitates a change in the law, because otherwise you're dealing with the law. So this law was passed in 2006, the oil law, and it was considered one of Chavez's most important pieces of legislation. And at the time, it made a lot of sense because there was a lot, oil prices were through the roof back then. They were roughly $100 a barrel, even higher than, which is kind of close to what we're seeing now. So there was no kind of shortage of people who really were desperate to invest in oil in Venezuela. Today, because of the framework of the U.S. sanctions regime, it's incredibly difficult to do that. And so this law is an attempt to adjust to the reality on the ground, which is that the U.S. has been impeding development of these oil fields for a decade or plus.
Okay. I just want to also say that, it just reminds us of, the tragedy of not being able to see the full actualization of socialism and these people's grassroots revolutions, because of the intense pressure that these hybrid wars have put on Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, and Venezuela for so long, and that makes our job much harder. I'm gonna go to this young lady here. Yeah, can you stand up and speak up? Oh, yeah, thank you.
Sure. We're potentially exclusively focused on helping service members get out of serving in wars of aggression, and to me, I think the larger system, the mechanism itself of the U.S. military and security apparatus, even when we're not actively waging a war of aggression, which is kind of never, right? But in and of itself, it is
Yeah, no, it's a great question. What I will say on that is that that would be an impossible question to answer in a reasonable amount of time, unfortunately. What I will say is that's all right. Let me give you two quick thoughts. One is the MLTF. We're having our membership meeting at 2:00, I think, in this room. So if you'd like to hear more from us about how we impact that, we'd welcome you to that. But I will say that this has always been a tension. And to some extent, one of the challenges that the MLTF faces is when dealing with issues of liberation and oppression, do you start with where people are right now? Where do you engage with them? We do have many of our members who are involved in counter-recruitment education, who are going into schools. We have someone, I think, in the room right over there who's very involved in that work. So that's been a part of what we've been doing for a long time. That said, I would also argue that for those who find themselves in the military, and bear in mind who enlists today, it is a lot of rural kids, a lot of people of color, a lot of poor people. Those are the people who enlist in the military, and also a lot of immigrants. And these are people who've been lied to by professional liars. Military recruiters are paid to lie, and they do it well. They're sick and twisted. They know what they're doing. And so as an organization, we, of course, support trying to educate young people about avoiding that. That said, many people believe in good faith that they're doing a good thing, that no one in their lives ever brought up these issues even. And so when they join, and then they have that moral crisis. The MLTF, our job has always been, we support people in liberation wherever they're at in that journey. And sometimes it's going to be while you're in. Sometimes it's going to be keeping you from joining. Sometimes it's going to be helping someone who did bad things when they're in, and they're now trying to come out on the other side and are trying to make amends. We've worked with people in all those categories. So that would be the short answer.
Thank you, James.
Sorry, can I just add a quick note?
Sure, yeah.
Because I work in Veterans Law in D.C., and I'd like to reiterate that keeping with the idea of also in keeping with the idea of going beyond just the law as a mechanism, we can't discount the fact that this country having no free college education and no health care that's not attached to work. If you had those things, it would hollow out military recruitment. Because the number of people who join the military so they can have access to health care, so they can have access to education. People who never intended on involving themselves in the conflict and do not have the moral foundation to believe such a thing is morally acceptable, but know that this is the only avenue by which I might be able to pay for college, or I might be able to ensure that I have health care for myself, for my children, for my spouse. So it is a larger thing than just saying whether or not I believe morally that this is something I should do, or whether or not, as an immigrant, I believe that this is how I become, acceptable in American society. Yeah. Show that I've served and I'm willing to sacrifice, and that's how I gain access to that ideology.
Thank you for adding that. In a moment, I'm just going to take another round of questions, starting with Leah, and then just bring it back to the panel. But I just wanted to also address her international law questions. So, if you look on the NLD website, you will see that over the years we've passed many different resolutions on Palestine, on Iran, on Latin America, and even though there's been a history of having to organize internally and do political education, we have for a long time supported, without fail, the sovereignty of other nations, right? And the self-determination of other nations, determination of other nations and peoples, including, and within that, the right of oppressed people to resist, including through armed struggle, right? And that is, when we look to international law for those rights, because that is fundamental to international law, right? There's a fundamental principle of international law, which is the principle of self-determination, in which the right to armed struggle, the right to struggle, including armed struggle, came out of, right? And particularly in the context of those who are fighting against the colonialist oppressors, right? Or racialized oppression. And that is something, the right of self-determination, everything that grew out of that is something that the global South and anti-fascists in the West fought for such a long time to be included in international law and the UN mechanisms. And yes, the international legal mechanisms that we have now, they suck. They suck beyond belief. But that might be a situation where we have to use it until we build something new, right? Or it might be a situation where we have to change the balance of power so that when we do go into these mechanisms, that we have more, like, it's like, the quote, like, between equal rights, power decides, right? And right now, these mechanisms exist within U.S. hegemony. But you know something? Why was the genocide so bad, the Biden-Blinken genocide? And why is this war in Iran so bad? Because they are realizing that their hegemony is beginning to unravel, right? And we see that especially in the way that Iran has responded, and we have been clear on Iran's right to sovereignty and to resistance, right? That the balance of power is changing, right? And so we have to continue to be in those conversations. However, I think it probably is more important for us to be on the streets, right? And helping the people to resist the imperialist economies that we're engaged in, and also, to resist in every way that they want to, and also to fight for the social rights that this gentleman, for example, was talking about. I think that does trump, right, our engagement in international law, but we still have to be part of those conversations, and it's still so valuable to countries like Cuba, etc., because it's a platform, So anyway, I'm going to go to Leah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the underlying theme across pretty much all of these issues and whether we're talking about the struggles in countries that are resisting imperialism, because these are people-driven movements which are directly contrary to imperialism and capitalism. And I think we also see that in the military service, and I'm glad you guys kind of addressed some of my question/statement on military service, which is that the U.S. military is overwhelmingly poor, Black, queer, and immigrant, and that the reason why we have people, primarily in our enlisted military, because I think there is a line that we have to acknowledge that there's a big difference between being an enlisted military member and an officer, and going through officer training, and that demographic is vastly different between these two sides of this military industrial structure. So my question about the military task force is, acknowledging the encouragement of having soldiers resist illegal orders or conscientiously object to their service inevitably means their separation from the armed forces. And in the vein of class warfare, acknowledging that that's not just losing their job, this is losing their health care, their access to housing, and that most enlisted military members have families, and usually quite a few children, and that most of our enlisted military is also availing themselves of social programs like SNAP in order to survive. So what types of other structures outside of strictly legal are in place to help these service members who have made this choice be able to make that choice and continue down that path of making that choice, knowing that it inevitably results in their separation from the armed forces?
I actually have to go to a meeting.
Okay.
So if you want to take over, I encourage you guys to stay, but I have a meeting. So.
I will say on that, I can tell you a little bit of what exists. What I can say, there's a lot more need than there is capacity right now. One of the things I would say is, so far what does exist is happening in local communities. It's happening with religious groups that are working with people who are on their way out, who are making that transition. But I would say, as a general rule, that has been a problem for a long time. I think more than 25 years. I've seen this problem of service members taking acts of resistance and then not having support afterwards, making the transition to the rest of their lives. That's a real problem. Now, I would also say that is a problem in a lot of people coming through trauma. There's an ongoing need. So I would say, unfortunately, the need is much greater than there is the capacity. And especially when you're looking at the broader, what I think can be a game changer, what was a game changer, say, 2009 to 2012, was there was a lot of organizing at that time by military families who were saying, we've had enough. We're tired of seeing our loved ones treated like shit. We want to do something about it. And that was a game changer. For many of these military spouses in particular, they found their voices. And one of the beautiful things are military spouses are not subject to the UCMJ, unlike their military loved ones. And so I think there's a lot of room for organizing. A lot of need is there. I will say for the MLTF right now, we're kind of in the moment we're having to focus on the most immediate issue, and that's the legal, because that's what we do. But there has to be a whole lot more blossoming out.
Now, this is a question promotion. I participate every other week with Code Pink China's action groups and Code Pink Palestine. Are there also ones for Cuba and Venezuela, and are opportunities for us to be part of them?
Yeah, it's not quite an action group. There is a Code Pink Latin America team that has a lot of webinars, and then specifically for Cuba, we do a lot of work with the National Network on Cuba. Cheryl's right there, so one of the co-chairs of the National Network, and with the Venezuela Solidarity.
But you don't have any committees like China, with China?
Yeah, not exactly. I'll bring that up to see if we can just set that up. That's a good idea.
In the back?
On behalf of the Cuba subcommittee, just want to thank you for your presentation. Tomorrow there will be a 1 o'clock workshop specifically on the role of the Guild and essential solidarity work for Cuba. And please check out our table where you can actually get the official State Department memo adopting a policy of learning about hunger in Cuba and other good stuff, including our history. So, thank you.
We are pretty much out of time at this point, so do you all have any final closing remarks you want to share? Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone so much for being here. Again, and I'll just mention the MLTF, we are having a meeting back in this room at 2 o'clock, so come and join us. And other than that, thank you so much.